In the shadow of the Colosseum, under the weight of marble arches and crumbling walls, there once ruled men who held the world in their hands. Yet, even emperors are mortal, and even empires can falter. This is the story of Rome's last rulers, the dynasties that promised eternity but delivered oblivion. In the fading light of Rome, when the sun dipped behind the distant hills and cast long shadows across the Forum, one could almost hear the whispers of a once mighty empire. Marble statues stood silent, their faces frozen in eternal vigilance, watching over streets that had once echoed with the triumphant footsteps of legions. And yet, the grandeur of Rome was no shield against decay. The emperors who now walk these hallowed halls inherited more than power. They inherited a fragile, trembling world that seemed to shiver beneath the weight of its own history. It was not always this way. There was a time when the empire stretched from the misty highlands of Britain to the golden sands of Egypt. Rome had built roads, aqueducts, and monuments that defied time itself. But greatness, as the ancients knew, is never permanent. Power, no matter how absolute, can falter. By the time the last emperors took the throne, the empire's foundations were already rotting from within. Corruption had seeped into every corner of government, turning once loyal senators into opportunists and advisors into schemers. Every decision, every edict carried the weight of centuries, and yet each was undermined by the subtle erosion of authority. These rulers were men of names remembered, and yet they were also men trapped by circumstances beyond their control. They inherited an empire whose very size had become its own undoing. Borders stretched thin, legions scattered like shadows over distant provinces, and communication lagged as months or even years passed before news traveled from one end of the empire to the other. In the heart of Rome, the emperors could issue commands, but the world beyond their palace gates moved according to its own rhythms, indifferent to imperial will. And so, the emperors became spectators of their own decline. They sat upon golden thrones, garments embroidered with the symbols of authority, while famine gnawed at distant provinces. Barbarian tribes pressed ever closer to the borders, and while rebellion simmered quietly in cities whose loyalty could no longer be bought with coin alone, their power, once absolute, became symbolic, a shadow of the glory their predecessors had commanded. The voices that once obeyed the call of Rome now murmured with fear, with dissent, and sometimes with open defiance. It was a world where even wisdom could not save a man. Advisors whispered counsel that was ignored or followed too late. Generals demanded reinforcements that the treasury could no longer provide. And yet, amidst the crumbling stone and fading banners, the emperors carried on. Some clung to tradition, insisting that Rome's strength lay in ritual and ceremony. Others tried to innovate, to bend the machine of empire to meet a changing world. But the wheel of fate is indifferent to human effort, and the machine had already rusted beyond repair. The tragedy of these rulers is not found in their mistakes alone, but in the very inheritance they received. An empire that could not sustain itself, no matter who wore the crown. They were emperors in name, yet prisoners of circumstance. Their decrees were proclamations to ghosts, their triumphs fleeting sparks in a night that was already darkening. And as the centuries would record, their reigns, filled with pomp and ritual, could not stave off the inevitable. Rome was slipping through their fingers, grain by grain, until nothing remained but the echo of what once was. History would remember their names, not as saviors, but as witnesses. Men who saw an empire in its twilight and could do nothing but hold on as the shadows deepened. In their struggle, there is a lesson that endures. Even power draped in gold and authority is fragile. Even an emperor can be helpless when the world itself begins to crumble. The story of Rome's final emperors is also the story of families, dynasties that promised continuity but delivered chaos. In the beginning, the word a dynasty carried weight, a promise of order, of bloodlines strong enough to hold the empire together. But as the centuries waned, the families that ruled Rome began to fray, unraveling like the tattered banners that hung in the Forum after years of neglect. Power became less a duty and more a possession, passed from father to son or brother to brother, with little regard for wisdom, strength, or even sanity. The Theodosian dynasty, for example, ruled a world already under siege from both within and without. Their emperors were educated in rhetoric and law, trained in courtly manners and ceremony, yet many lacked the iron will required to confront an empire in collapse. The sons of emperors inherited thrones like gifts rather than responsibilities. And when ambition, envy, and greed crept into palace halls, the result was predictable. Betrayal, intrigue, and a relentless cycle of weak leadership. Each misstep amplified the fragility of Rome like a crack running through the foundation of a once mighty temple. It was not only the incompetence of rulers that doomed the dynasties, but their blindness to the world beyond marble walls. They celebrated triumphs in the Senate while the provinces starved, while barbarian tribes tested the borders, while mercenary armies demanded ever greater tributes. Sons became emperors, nephews became generals, and yet their reigns revealed the same pattern. Personal ambition eclipsed public duty. Family loyalty, once a stabilizing force, became a weapon. Brothers betrayed brothers. Cousins schemed against one another. The throne was no longer a platform for the survival of an empire. It had become a throne of peril, where one false move could topple the balance of power and accelerate Rome's decline. The Valentinian dynasty, rising soon after, offered no salvation. Here, too, succession was a game of politics rather than governance. A young emperor, enthroned as a child, became a pawn for ambitious generals and scheming courtiers. Decisions meant to protect the empire were postponed or perverted by those who saw only advantage, not legacy. And while Rome's enemies gathered on the horizon, the dynasties squabbled within palace walls, leaving the empire vulnerable, exposed, and ultimately defenseless. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of dynastic rule is this: the hope of stability is built on trust, on the belief that bloodlines can carry wisdom across generations. But wisdom is not hereditary. Strength is not inherited. And when those who sat upon the throne failed to rise to the moment, the empire faltered. Not because of fate alone, but because those entrusted with its survival chose self-interest over duty. Their crowns were heavy, yes, but the burdens of empire were heavier still. Rome's last emperors were heirs to glory, yet their hands were tied, their vision clouded, and their hearts often misguided. They ruled with titles and ceremonies, with parades and proclamations, but they could not rule with the clarity or courage that history demanded. And in that failure, the dynasties became both a symbol and a cause of Rome's undoing. Men born to greatness, yet unable to wield it, watching as the empire they inherited slipped quietly into the hands of time and history. Rome, in its final centuries, was a kingdom of gold and shadows, where wealth flowed through the veins of the city, even as its lifeblood drained from the provinces. The emperors, adorned in robes of purple and gold, presided over an empire that seemed eternal, yet beneath the surface, the machinery of power was grinding to a halt. The treasury, once overflowing with tribute and spoils of conquest, was now stretched thin, leaking at every seam. The empire had grown too vast, its borders too distant, and its ambitions far beyond what its resources could sustain. Money, once a tool of conquest, had become a constant demand. Armies were paid in silver, sometimes in arrears, while mercenaries, loyal only to coin, watched the horizon for signs of weakness. Roads cracked, aqueducts crumbled, and granaries in distant provinces struggled to supply the hungry. Inflation ran rampant, and the emperor's attempts to control it were like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. Tax collectors roamed the countryside, exacting tribute from citizens who had little to give, and in the cities, resentment simmered quietly beneath the surface. The overextension of Rome was not merely a financial issue. It was a question of survival. Legions were scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, defending borders that stretched from the frozen Rhine to the sun-baked deserts of the Sahara. The emperors could issue commands from the marble palaces in Rome or Constantinople, but the world moved too fast, the threats too numerous. Each province demanded attention, each frontier demanded troops, yet the coffers were empty and the loyalty of soldiers uncertain. Rome was stretched like a bowstring, and one wrong move could snap it in two. Economic decay also carried with it a moral weight. Trade routes became dangerous as bandits and invaders roamed freely. Cities, once bustling with merchants, artisans, and scholars, began to hollow out. The vibrancy of Rome, which had made it a beacon for the known world, was fading. Public works deteriorated, and infrastructure that had supported civilization for centuries began to crumble. The empire's brilliance became a facade, masking the cracks in its foundation, visible only to those who looked closely, and tragic in their inevitability. Yet the emperors continued to spend. They built monuments, commissioned statues, and celebrated victories that were more symbolic than strategic. Their vanity, their insistence on grandeur, only deepened the economic wound. Rome could not conquer prosperity the way it had once conquered lands. Money could not fill the gap left by dwindling resources, a restless population, or armies that demanded more than the empire could give. And as the empire stretched itself thinner and thinner, every border became a vulnerability, every province a potential spark for rebellion. In the end, economic decay was not merely an abstract concept. It was a living force that undermined the authority of emperors, the loyalty of armies, and the faith of citizens. Rome's wealth had once been its strength. Now, it had become a mirror reflecting its fragility. The emperors sat on their thrones, powerful and titled, but powerless in reality, watching an empire that could no longer sustain the weight of its own ambition. And as gold left the treasury, and the provinces began to falter, the fate of Rome was sealed, not by swords alone, but by the slow, inexorable erosion of the very systems that had once made it immortal. Beyond the walls of Rome, beyond the marble and the gold, the world was changing. The once feared legions, symbols of Roman might, were now stretched thin, scattered across distant lands, defending an empire that had grown too vast for any one hand to hold. From the forests of Germania to the plains of Gaul, from the rivers of Dacia to the deserts of North Africa, the enemies of Rome watched patient and relentless as the empire weakened from within. These were not merely invaders. They were the reflection of Rome's own vulnerability, armies that tested their cracks in a civilization that had once seemed indestructible. The Visigoths, driven by hunger and ambition, pressed into Roman territory with a ferocity that could not be ignored. They were warriors shaped by survival, not ceremony, and they understood the weakness of the emperors they faced. Rome attempted to repel them with treaties, with bribes, with generals commanding tired and underpaid soldiers. But each victory was temporary, each compromise a delay, not a solution. And when the sack of Rome came in 410 AD, the city's golden streets trembled under the footsteps of conquerors, a symbolic thunderclap announcing that the era of invincibility had ended. The Vandals, crossing the Mediterranean in swift, devastating raids, showed that Rome could no longer control the seas that had once been its lifeblood. Coastal cities fell, treasure was looted, and the emperors seated in distant palaces could do nothing but watch as centuries of accumulated wealth and pride slipped into the hands of outsiders. And while these invaders struck, other threats emerged simultaneously. The Huns from the east, riding like storms across the plains, scattering tribes before them, pressing pressure upon an empire already fraying at the edge. The emperors of Rome were trained to command, to inspire, to strategize, but they were not omnipotent. The empire demanded more than any man could deliver. Generals urged immediate action, senators debated endlessly, and mercenary armies expected their wages. Rome's borders became a theater of constant conflict, and each defeat, each lost battle, chipped away at the authority of the throne. Where once an emperor's word could summon legions from across the empire, now it summoned only exhaustion, hesitation, and fear. It was not merely the strength of the barbarians that defeated Rome, but the combination of external threat and internal decay. The empire, overextended and weakened, became a prize for those bold enough to take it. Every incursion exposed the fractures in Rome's defenses, the failure of dynasties to adapt, and the limits of wealth and tradition. The military, once the heart of Roman identity, had become a shadow of itself, struggling to defend a civilization that had long outgrown its capacity to survive. And so, Rome fell again and again, not in a single cataclysm, but in a series of blows that accumulated, like water eroding stone. Each barbarian victory was a reminder that the empire was no longer invincible, that the emperors were not gods, but men tasked with an impossible charge. And in those defeats, the people of Rome came to understand a terrible truth. Their world, their civilization was mortal. The age of conquest had ended, and the empire that had once ruled the known world was now fighting simply to exist. And then came the final act. The sun rose over Rome one morning as it had for centuries, but the city, the empire, and its emperors were no longer the masters of history, and they were its witnesses. In 476 AD, a name would be written in the annals of time. Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor barely more than a child, carried the weight of a crumbling world upon his small shoulders. The Western Empire had been battered, drained, and humiliated. And now it would surrender, not in flames or blood, but in quiet inevitability. Odoacer, the chieftain of the Germanic Foederati, demanded what had long been coming, the throne. Romulus, powerless and without support, yielded. The centuries of Roman glory, of legions marching, of senators debating, of emperors striving against impossible odds, ended not with the clash of swords, but with a simple abdication. The empire did not vanish in an instant. It had already fallen piece by piece. But this moment marked its symbolic and irrevocable end. The Western Empire had succumbed to forces both internal and external. The dynasties had failed, the economy had faltered, the military had weakened, and the barbarians had pressed relentlessly at the gates. Yet in its fall, there was a strange continuity. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, would endure, preserving the memory, the knowledge, and the art of Rome for centuries to come. The story of the West was a cautionary tale that even the greatest of empires, the mightiest of civilizations, can unravel when leadership falters and the foundations of power decay. Rome's fall was not a spectacle of sudden destruction. It was the slow, inexorable whisper of time, claiming what history had built. Streets that had once echoed with triumph now lay silent. Forums that had thrummed with debate now heard only the wind. Theaters and baths became relics of a forgotten era, monuments to ambition, pride, and human frailty. And yet even in decay, the legacy of Rome endured, in language, in law, and architecture, and in the very imagination of the world. The emperors who came last were not villains. They were men caught in a storm they could not control. They ruled with ceremony, with dignity, with as much strength as they could summon. But strength alone could not reverse centuries of decline. And so the empire slipped from their hands, leaving them as witnesses to the end of an age. History remembers them not only for their failures, but for their struggle, for the human effort to uphold greatness against impossible odds. In the silence that followed, one could almost hear the heartbeat of Rome, fading but not forgotten. Its story is a lesson to all who wield power, that empires, like men, are mortal, that glory can be fleeting, and that even the strongest dynasty, the most brilliant ruler, cannot escape the currents of history. And yet in remembering and studying, in honoring the rise and fall, we find something enduring, a reminder that human ambition, for all its fragility, leaves a mark on the world that time itself cannot erase.